gives me great pleasure now to welcome the Chief Economic Advisor of Government of India, Mr. K.V. Subramanian. Mr. Subramanian, fantastic to connect with you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us for the Birla Voyage 2020. I've been told this is the biggest financial voyage, so we are quite excited to have you on the show. Now, the Prime Minister has already announced the big package, but in last 2 days, what we've heard from the Finance Minister is the blueprint and the fine parts are not really focused around direct spending. Do you think there is yet more to come, or this package in a sense has been designed considering the fiscal constraints?
Good afternoon, Nikunj, and good afternoon to all the participants. I'm glad to be here sharing my thoughts with all of you. I think firstly, when we understand the package that has been announced, the package needs to be seen in the light of a new vision that has been articulated by the Honorable Prime Minister. And in some sense, there is an attempt to try and construct, something equivalent of a New Deal that President Roosevelt came up with after during the Great Depression. And not only was there measures in terms of monetary, fiscal, and liquidity, etc. then, but more importantly, there were a bunch of reforms as well, and reforms with the vision of a self-reliant India, or Atmanirbhar Bharat. Maybe later I can give some color, in terms of, as an economist, how I think about self-reliant India, because oftentimes people can always, mistake it to be equivalent to be something from the past, which is not what it is intended to be. Given that vision, and given the pandemic, there is basically value to the package, and the package is it's constructed based on the following principle. If we think about from first principles, if we think about the effect of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, it is a war-like situation, but it is different from a war, because in a war, what happens is demand suffers because of uncertainty. For instance, when a war is going on, people will not travel that much. Tourism, for instance, takes a beating. A lot of discretionary or non-essential items, those basically do not get consumed as much. There is a demand side impact. But in a war, what also happens is there are huge supply side disruptions because factories get bombed, factories basically just get converted into rubble, and that creates permanent disruptions on the supply side. In contrast, in the case of the COVID, there are supply side disruptions, but these are not permanent because no factory is basically getting sort of just getting reduced to a rubble. What you have is a situation where the hands are not there on the machines yet, and there is basically that temporary impact on the supply side. Therefore, if you think about it, compared to a situation like a war, what needs to happen is a lot more focus needs to be on temporary liquidity, so that firms can tide over their difficulties, so that temporary inconveniences and temporary distress that firms are facing does not create permanent damage. That is one very, very important aspect on the supply side intervention. On the demand side as well, especially those where there are essential items, those have been worked on. More importantly, the demand side impact also can manifest if you have people, losing their jobs in significant numbers. Then, obviously they will not have the disposable income to spend. And in which case, then you will have, the significant demand side impact. So if you think about the demand side measures itself, it is in one way, one is basically trying to reduce the impact on, any detrimental impact on unemployment. And here it is important to remember, not only India, but globally, for instance, if you take the United States, the number of people filing for unemployment insurance in the United States is now at a historical high, even greater than that during the Great Depression. And so this is something that is a first order issue that every country has to grapple with by ensuring that supply side concerns and liquidity concerns of firms do not lead to retrenchment of people. You are thereby also having a demand side impact by basically retaining demand in some sense by retaining the disposable income. Second, also those people who are less likely to be affected to basically become unemployed, their disposable income has been increased through not only the automatic stabilizers, what we economists call as automatic stabilizers because of the tax part, but there's also been the reduction in the PPF rates, the reduction in basically some of the holidays that have been given. All these also then end up putting disposable income in the hands of consumers. So that's how the measures have been basically thought about. Now the reason, and I think at this point it is also good for me to compare with other countries. We've been, for instance, ever since March itself, we've been studying each country's package threadbare. One of the big takeaways for us has been that countries have employed different portfolio of fiscal, monetary, and liquidity measures depending on where they had greater space. And India has done the same as well. If you take between the fiscal and the monetary side, and on the liquidity as well, we clearly had more space on the monetary side. And given that we have a lot of state-owned institutions as well, by giving them some capital or through a guarantee, etc., we can leverage and have far significant impact without necessarily constraining our fiscal side too much, because there's also the concern of possible impact on the ratings, etc., which is why I had actually also mentioned in one of my comments that there is no free lunch. It is important to keep in mind. So I think eventually, if you look at the policy package that has been brought in, it's a smart combination of the fiscal, liquidity and monetary, by keeping in mind where we have greater space. And that's what the other important part also is, there is, if you look at, from a macroeconomic point of view, when you give freebies versus when you basically give people, sort of retain their ability to contribute, right? The latter is always a better idea. For instance, and this is research in macroeconomics shows that when you give freebies, that can make people lazy and thereby, in the long run, even medium to long run, shrink supply because people may not produce enough. So, but when you give freebies does enhance demand. So if you have a situation of increasing demand but supply shrinking, that can have inflationary impact. But if you actually don't give freebies and instead, enhance productive capacity or retain productive capacity, I think at this point in time, given the COVID episode, it's far more important to retain productive capacity as much as possible by alleviating some of the temporary troubles that I spoke about. So which can thereby ensure that there aren't as many supply side disruptions, so that inflationary pressures don't build up. So this is sort of in some sense, some of the core principles that have guided, the stimulus package.
Economists and financial commentators, we love to analyze every line, what the CA has to say and what the finance minister has to say. I'm going to keep that analysis aside, but talk about big picture, a question which you've not been asked before. I'm sure because of this crisis, the shape of the economy will change, and it is bound to change. Whenever things will normalize, how do you think the shape of the economy, at least in India, will change?
So, Nikunj, I have, even in normal times, I've always been careful about giving a prognosis on the future. And especially during times like this, everybody has to be extremely careful because we are dealing with a situation of unknown unknowns. And so anybody's assessment, including mine or, someone else, it's important to keep in mind that there is going to be uncertainty. It's as if, even a Wasim Akram, if he's bowling on a bad pitch, the ball the way, how will it behave? Actually, even Wasim Akram cannot necessarily predict. Some balls may just basically shoot through, just and not rise at all, and some balls may really, sort of rise to, let's say, to the, bounce a lot. So that's the kind of situation we are in, and that's why I want to sort of mention that caveat. With that caveat in mind, and I think whenever participants take into account what I'm talking, they should not just focus on what I'm saying as my prediction, but keep in mind the uncertainty that I've actually talked about. That nuance is very important. With that preamble, now let me say what are, I think, the important changes that will happen in the economy. I think, for one, the sectoral, allocation between services, manufacturing, agriculture, that may actually also have an impact. And I think from India's perspective, this possibly is a good opportunity to do a reset and enhance the scope of manufacturing in the economy, because unlike services, where the social distancing sort of puts some question marks on some very key service sectors, because compared to manufacturing, services is a sector which relies a lot more interpersonal interactions. Therefore, this COVID episode, for the time that it lasts, it's likely to have a greater impact on service sector than on manufacturing. And because we are a population that has a large number of youth who need jobs, manufacturing is that outlet that can generate jobs. Together with companies that are actually in China, many of whom who want to relocate. So this, these are some of the sort of favorable conditions that are coming together for India to reset and actually increase its its presence in manufacturing in terms of globally, but also within the country itself to have far more manufacturing presence and thereby create jobs. So that's, I think, number one key change that I foresee. Second, as you would have seen, today you must have read about the Department of Personnel in the government, thinking about 15 days of work from home, for government employees. Now, this is having now been in government for almost 1.5 years. I think it's a very big mindset change. Oftentimes status quo is one thing that tends to be, lot more likely to be perpetuated in any government, be it in India or anywhere else, actually. And so this is an important change, and it signals the fact that the way we work is also quite likely to change, not only within the government, but also in the private sector as well. For instance, in my own team, I have always maintained that as long as you produce the output, I don't care, if you're someone who's actually really smart, you work for 6 hours and you actually produce very high quality output, good for you. I don't care about, quote unquote, impression management, that you keep showing me that you're basically, inefficient. So, that you basically put in a lot of hours and don't necessarily, let's say, produce enough output. So I can actually foresee now that, many more people will think along the same lines, that, I don't care whether you're actually working from home or you're working from office, as long as you're able to actually produce the deliverables that are required, that are expected, I am fine with you. So I think this thinking is likely to increase more, and thereby generate a greater push for work from home. That's a second. A third key thing, I think, is if you look at, and of course, if this what I'm going to speak about has come with its costs, but the pandemic and thereby the lockdown is by far the best natural experiment on how too much economic activity can basically have a detrimental effect on the climate, for instance. I think, and if you think about the Ganges, for instance, I've seen pictures of Ganges in Varanasi being so clean, almost water has become potable, right? And that has happened because industrial effluents that used to go into the into the Ganges are not happening, and therefore despite all the effort that actually various governments have put in over decades, which couldn't achieve this outcome. Just the fact that we basically industrial effluents were not poured into the Ganges has made that very clean. So, and similarly, people in the plains, for instance, in Jalandhar, have been able to, see the Himalayas, for instance. So this is a third aspect, which is, I think left to ourselves, humanity would not have had the courage to be able to, do this natural experiment. But because it was forced on us, and thereby we've been able to see the benefits that has come. Now, I actually am very much empathetic to the economic costs that it imposes, which I'm, and we need to do much about it. But I would also say that I think there can't be a better way. As they say, the proof of the pudding lies in the eating. And this particular, natural episode has provided that proof of the pudding, and thereby made the case that maybe some scaling down of economic activity, not necessarily across the board, but those that actually, affect our climate, very, very detrimentally, may be something that we can, think about. I think broadly, these are three key. From an Indian perspective, I would also say, this is a matter of point of view. I actually having, there are people who look at every crisis as an opportunity, and there are people who basically look at a crisis as only a crisis. And I can confidently say that the Honorable Prime Minister, looks at a crisis as an opportunity. To see someone who's looking for solutions to problems, and this is in some sense, in 1991, the then Prime Minister, Narasimha Rao, utilized that crisis to actually be able to push through reforms which would have not happened in normal times. And similarly, now I think we are, and people have read about it, about the labor reforms, about the land reforms. Karnataka, for instance, APMC, which is a important product market reform that we basically that we are several states are embarking on, which may not have happened in normal times. And this is the other thing that actually I would mention is that it's possible we can recalibrate a little bit here and there, but the crisis provides an opportunity, because especially when I talk about from the Indian labor's perspective, right? Now, Indian labor is not just the 11% that works in the formal sector. Indian labor also includes the 89% that works in the informal sector. And here I actually will use a parallel. I have, I would say now looking back, had the privilege of traveling in a third-class compartment in a railway train. And one of the things that stands out is, whoever gets into that third-class compartment at the origin station, they are the only ones that get the space. And these quarters are their rights. So nobody else in any other station can get into the third-class compartment, because those who are inside end up preventing anybody else coming in. The situation with our labor force is also very similar. The 11% are those that are basically inside that compartment and are managing to reach their destination. They have the privilege. But there's an 89% that also wants inclusion, economic and social inclusion, by having a formal sector job. And the squatters basically in some sense are not providing them that opportunity. So this is a very important aspect, and when you look at it from the perspective of migrant labor as well, migrant labor is, after all, a very important part of the informal sector labor. And on the one hand, we cannot be shedding tears for migrant labor, and on the other hand, not doing enough in removing the obstacles that basically, that we've had for 7 decades now, in generating enough employment. So I think from India's perspective, while there will be short-term troubles, and the government is trying its very best to alleviate these troubles, I also look at this as an opportunity, and hopefully we will basically go and we'll be seizing.
Brilliantly concise that how to differentiate between good and bad and where there's opportunity. I'm going to also encourage Bhupesh to come in with a question, and he's been really waiting for this opportunity. And thank you very much for agreeing to take questions.
Good afternoon, sir. You mentioned about the policy space, relative policy space between fiscal and monetary policy. I mean, in India, the borrowing rate still remains quite high. Even now, when the median market estimates are of 0% growth, 10 years sovereign is trading at 6%. For the last 5 years, I mean, inflation has averaged around 4%. Weighted average lending rate has been around 10%. Would you agree that we need a more radical reduction in rates, maybe closer to 0% or something like that? I mean, given the fact that growth is supposed to be quite low, and as you rightly mentioned, that policy space in that direction is much higher.
See, before I respond to this, Bhupesh, I think it's important to understand that, in a market economy, rates are determined by demand and supply. I think, and intervention makes sense when there is a market failure. Government intervention makes sense when there's a market failure. That's a broader point. We can talk about possible, is there a market failure in the market for Government of India bonds, etc. I don't know. I don't think there is. There is a possibility for basically the space on the monetary side to be utilized, because this year certainly output will be significantly lower than the potential output, and if you look at in India historically, the term spread is basically the difference between the 10-year rate and the long run rate and the short run or the repo rate, for instance. Historically, the spread has been 1%, about 1% or thereabouts. So if we are able to reduce at the short end, then it's possible the long end might come down. But I must, by the way, say that what has happened with the yield curve now is, in some sense, it has actually, the long end has remained where it has, and the short end, it just has pivoted with that. Basically, because of the rate cuts, the short end has come down, but the long end has actually not come down. Typically, what happens is, when there is a parallel shift in the yield curve, when the short end comes down, the long end also comes down. So that's how the entire, but the long end has continued to be where it is, and actually it has just pivoted. So the term spread has increased. Now, you must remember that even if, let's say, monetary policy, goes and brings down this particular, the shorter rate, if this end continues to be where it is, then, borrowing costs will be higher. So there is a possibility, therefore, for some quantitative easing, and the RTO operations that RBI is doing actually is intended in that direction. But it can be, some of the operations can be targeted at the specific, the long run rate itself, and that may help. But overall, I think I would say that in a market economy, these have to be determined by the market, and I don't think regulatorily mandating some rate will have far more costs than benefits, and that's something which you actually have to we resist the temptation for. Let me add one more element to this, which is, I do expect the long end to come down significantly because of the the steps that we've taken towards the inclusion of the Government of India bonds in the bond index, sovereign bond indices. And why do I say this? Because about $4 trillion of money tracks these bond indices. India is expected to have a weight of around 1.5 to 3% in these bond indices. Even at the lower end, 1.5% translates into about $60 billion, which is about the same as our gross borrowing in a year. So this is a 100% increase possible in the supply of money coming into the Government of India bond markets, and coming in from a new clientele, which is basically international investors. So that is likely to bring down the long end. But I'll summarize again by saying that it has to happen through the market means of greater supply, not just by mandating.
I mean, central bankers around the world have been much more aggressive in bringing down even the longer end rates. Policies like that monetization of government debt, because a lot of concern in the market is that there's a lot of government paper which is going to come, government borrowing has been increased. And therefore, there may be need for, policy measures like inclusion of government bonds in international indices. It will take some time to flow into the real economy. Do you believe that in the meantime, there may be a need for more aggressive RBI, maybe steps like tight monetization? Do you approve of that? Or maybe like operation twist and all?
No, the way governments and across other countries have done is basically through quantitative easing. Focusing their market operations on specific points on the yield curve, which is something that I've also recommended. Something which actually is now it's less clear to me that the monetization can be a way of bringing down the long end of the yield curve. That's something which there are both costs and benefits. I think it will get too technical if we get into that discussion here for the rest of the viewers. But we can have a private chat about it.
Okay, so let me talk about something which could be of wider audience. And it's always this catch-22 situation which you'll have to face, which is that if you stimulate more, we will come back and say government is not bothered about fiscal deficit, inflation will come back. If you don't stimulate, we will come back and say the government is not doing enough. It's a very difficult proposition, isn't it?
No, but that I think is that's par for the course, for people who basically do policy. I think we all have to recognize that criticism is actually something that we have to expect and anticipate and take it in the right spirit and use that to sort of improve, wherever necessary. So I don't necessarily look at that as a bad thing. That's that said, that is of course a sort of a philosophical, response to the. I think we actually, as I was mentioning earlier as well, by exploiting or by utilizing the fact that we have more monetary space and the fact that we have a lot of state-owned institutions as well, through whom some of these measures can be driven. We have, I think, got the balance right by ensuring that we basically don't throw caution to the winds. And what I meant by that is just going and splurging, as if there is no tomorrow, and on the fiscal side primarily. I think we've not done that. We have been cautious about it. But, as Chinese Premier Deng Xiaoping used to say, I don't care about the color of the cat as long as it catches mice. In here the color of that cat is monetary, fiscal, liquidity, etc. We don't care about it either. We're just using all these mechanisms together. So I think, we have gotten that balance right, where we've not, splurged too much on the fiscal side, yet have given enough, steps. And as you would have noticed, it's not just focused on the, on let's say corporations, but even the vulnerable sections like migrant laborers, small and marginal farmers. Yesterday the Honorable Finance Minister talked about minimum wages being increased, and actually a uniform minimum wage across the country, something that the Economic Survey of July 2019 had recommended. The other aspect of increasing the definition of MSMEs, because this is also something that the July 2019 Economic Survey had talked about, that the way the definition of SMEs is that it provides a perverse incentive for SMEs to remain small. And that definition has actually been altered so that the growth incentive is provided for SMEs and MSMEs. That it's important because it's finally small firms that grow to be bigger are the ones that create far more jobs. And that's something which is important. So I think overall, we have actually gotten this balance, between the fiscal, monetary and the liquidity measures, quite well. Because we have been conscious about both the costs and benefits, on either side, especially where space is limited, costs are greater than the benefits. Where space is higher, benefits are greater than the cost, and that's why we've actually utilized that portfolio.
I'll not extend our appointment beyond a point. So just one last question from me. Bhupesh has got a follow-up question. The challenge for the economy right now is confidence of a crisis in terms of lending. RBI has done a fantastic job of bringing liquidity back. Banks have surplus liquidity. Banks are saying we want to lend, but we have to be cognizant of risk and NPAs. Now, government cannot force banks to lend. That's not the right thing. Government is doing the bit by letting MSCs borrow. But is that enough? Because when I speak to bankers, they're not scared, but they are worried. When I speak to RBI is astonished that why banks are not lending. The system has got jammed. It's fear or something else, I don't know. So what can be done?
No, in fact, actually, see, Nikunj, this was one of the key things that we incorporated into the design of the package. If you pay, careful attention to the, to the 20% extended, extension of working capital and term loans, 3 lakh crores of it through the MSMEs. What we did is we basically have given 100% guarantee on it, which means basically the bank does not face any risk at all. The bank is, effectively the bank can price it like a risk-free loan because the entire loss on it is borne by the guaranteeing corporation, which itself has been provided, the capital by the government. So in this case, the risk aversion, which is what is holding bankers back, which is why they're sitting on 8.5 lakh crores of, of basically reverse repo money with the RBI. Now, 3 lakh crores of that can actually be put into the MSMEs, and 3 lakh out of 8.5 lakh crores is almost like 45%. So, and by making it completely, risk-free, and this is something I can actually share with you. We had, deliberations on it initially saying, what if we basically have, let's say, first loss guarantee for 25%, 30%, etc. And when we were thinking about this, and then we felt that, if we don't give 100% guarantee, then even with a small residual risk, it's possible that banks basically may feel skittish in lending. And so it is really critical for us to actually, have that 100% guarantee. And so this particular fear, we've taken it on, front on in designing it. So, and this is for every SME, MSME that has borrowed from a bank. And by the way, I was looking at some tax return data to look at what percentage of MSMEs are covered in this, under the new definition. So if you look at the tax, the corporate tax return data, 98% of the filers have a turnover less than 75 crores. Now, in the new definition, even a medium MSME is a medium MSME basically is up to 100 crores of turnover. So, little bit more than 98% of all MSMEs are covered in this particular, in this scheme. And every MSME that has a loan already from the bank is now entitled to a 20% increase, 100% guaranteed by the government, which is good because if you think about it, the average firm, in India turns its inventory over about 4 or 5 times a year, which means that if you think about it, a 20% increase will enable them to, give them working capital for at least a quarter, and firms themselves will also tighten their belts, they will take their steps. And so this can be a big cushion thereby in enabling them to continue their operations. So all MSMEs that have taken loans from banks are covered. And this is not just in terms of the, stressed ones, the good ones, also have been included, right? These are loans that are, can be given to any company that was actually, not SMA 2 as of February. Apart from that, there is also a sub-debt scheme that has been brought in, subordinate debt scheme for the stressed MSMEs, and 50,000 crores of equity infusion, through the fund of funds, for the MSMEs as well. And in other words, if you think about it, therefore, in terms of the capital structure of any typical company, you have debt, you have subordinated debt, and you have equity. Sometimes you may have some preferential shares, but if you leave that preferential shares out, the entire capital structure has been covered as well. So, in terms of the vertical coverage on the capital structure, everything has been covered. In terms of the horizontal, in terms of the kind of MSMEs that are, those also have been covered. So I think it is, quite comprehensive, in terms of coverage of MSMEs. So, and it has been designed in such a way that these can be rolled out very quickly. Banks don't have to do any worry. They basically are getting the guarantee and just, and they've anyway done the credit, evaluation of these MSMEs when they would have given their initial loans. that still leaves some MSMEs who, let's say, have not yet borrowed from banks. They may have borrowed from NBFCs. And here's where the set of measures that have been announced for NBFCs, especially the buyer of last resort, facility, where basically NBFC bonds will be bought by this through the scheme. So that enables then the NBFCs to on-lend to MSMEs, who haven't borrowed from banks. So together, actually, the vertical coverage is also quite large, and as I said, the horizontal coverage. And these, in some sense, I can say, I mean, maybe it's not really a justification as such, but we took time because we wanted to actually ensure that it doesn't look, just good on paper, but keep in mind some of the practical, aspects so that it can be rolled out very quickly without, too much of hindrances in terms of the implementation.
So while the steps taken on NBFCs and SMEs are quite commendable, I mean, there are certain sectors which are going to be disproportionately impacted by the crisis. For example, real estate, which is also a big employment generator. Do we expect a similar backdrop over there?
So the facilities are for NBFCs, for MFIs, and for HFCs. So, the buyer of last resort facility has been provided for them. The forbearance also has been provided by RBI. There is basically, they've also been kept in mind. And some of the, especially some of the steps that have been taken, because of force majeure on the contracts, etc. Those are also, important, important room that's provided for, for all these sectors, especially the real estate, because that's where contracts are far more, contractual work is a lot more in real estate.
Okay, closing comments. How has life changed for you personally? All of us are working from home.
For me, I think the hard part has been staying all alone and staying away from family, especially at a time when I hear my friends saying, "Oh, we actually, Sunday evening we watched a movie together," and I think that's one. But to be honest, actually, the privilege of getting to contribute, at a time like this is also something. I mean, there are always costs to these things. So, but that's one of the key changes that has happened. I used to, go once in 2-3 weeks to Hyderabad for the weekend, and that I haven't been able to do. So that's how my life has changed. But I think these have been very, in some sense, therefore, I have actually been working almost all my waking hours. So, and that's a good thing. I think, see, I have always believed that how one thinks about a crisis is it relates a lot to a point of view. You can look at the glass as half full or as half empty. Looking at the glass half full does not mean that we basically are insulated from the difficulties others are facing. We need to remain empathetic to it, but at the same time also, take the crisis as an opportunity to also, transform and really, and make big changes. For instance, take 1991, right? I remember, I just started college then, and I remember there was so much opposition even within within his own party to the prime minister. Finally, it's the prime minister who basically ends up having to basically have the courage to implement such reforms. And so in my own books I give a large amount, a lion's share of the credit to P.V. Narasimha Rao for the reforms that he implemented, because he was the one that was taking the flak for for basically some of the opposition that was coming in. In fact, I do remember a couple of times the then finance minister also offering his resignation because the criticism that was being leveled at him, when the prime minister stood like a solid rock saying, "No, I am there behind you." And that's how reforms get done, because of such political will. And I think in some sense, actually, though, there are important lessons that have been learned from there, to be able to that tough times oftentimes need tough decisions to be made as well. And some tough decisions will have will generate debate, which is good, and there will be some opposition as well. But if you think about it, today when history looks back, history looks back and remembers with gratitude PV Narasimha Rao, who even remembers those that opposed, and wanted to maintain status quo at that point in time.
I'm sure when my 8-year-old son will reach financial history of 2020, he will have the same thing to say, that the current Prime Minister and his team took the right decisions and the tough decisions at a time of crisis. There's no debate on the fact that it's been not a pleasure, but a rare pleasure to have you on this forum. Thank you for your time. And I certainly hope next time when we interact and meet you in person.
My pleasure. And I must say, actually, the wonderful way in which you come here. This is the second time I've actually had that, opportunity and privilege. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.